Let's bring in congressional reporter for The Hill, Michael Schnell, and it is really good to have you on this morning. Give us a sense of everything that went down yesterday, especially as it pertains to repealing IRS funding.
Right. So if we start with that IRS bill, Mika, this was the bill that Kevin McCarthy had been teasing as the first piece of legislation that a House GOP majority would bring up should they win control of the chamber. And essentially what this bill does is it rescinds the bulk of that $80 billion that was appropriated to boost funding for the IRS in the Democrats' Inflation Reduction Act passed over the summer. And now the majority of that spending was basically meant to zero in on enforcement of high income earners. But Republicans had sort of characterized this as a way that the IRS was going to hire 87,000 new agents, though the department has come back and said that that is just not true. This was meant for not just agents, but hiring other employees, ones in customer service, computer science, and accounting for the tens of thousands of employees they expect to resign or quit over the next 10 years. But nonetheless, Republicans had took this up as the first piece of legislation to pass in the House GOP majority. It kind of gives you a sense of what the next 2 years may look like. Messaging bills coming from House Republicans that will appease the base that really have no chance of moving in the Democratic-controlled Senate.
It's fascinating. The CBO reports, the Congressional Budget Office reports that this will cost $186 billion, translating into $114 billion increase in deficits over the next decade. It's remarkable. So on their first day at work, they increased the deficit by over $100 billion.
That's right. And this CBO report, it came yesterday afternoon as House Republicans were preparing to bring this bill to the floor and conduct debate. And as you could expect, this was one point that Democrats had brought up a number of times on the House floor. But nonetheless, the bill passed all along party lines, with all Republicans present voting for it, all Democrats present voting against it. But again, it likely has no chance in the Senate. And even President Biden came out against it, with the White House putting out a statement of administrative policy opposing the legislation.
All right. Congressional reporter for The Hill, Michael Schnell. Thank you so much. Whether it passes or not, Richard Haass, you have Republicans who, once again, one day in, passed legislation that would jack up the deficit by $100 billion. It seems one of the great ironies over the past 20 years that Republicans talk about deficits and smaller government, and yet deficits grew at record rates under Donald Trump. He inherited a deficit from Barack Obama, and he jacked the deficit up every single year of his presidency, the 4 years of his presidency. Record debt, record deficits. You can say the same for George W. Bush, who inherited a $155 billion surplus and left with massive deficits, record deficits. This is incredible. These Republicans just, again, I keep saying this, Richard. I know you're a former Republican yourself. I think you were. The Republican Party, they just don't learn.
As was once said about the kings of France, they experience history, they don't learn from it. Look, this is irresponsible. It's also, Joe, connecting to something else you said. It doesn't just fail the economics test. And it also makes us more vulnerable to the question of foreign funding of American debt. Again, how are you anti-China if you make the United States more vulnerable to markets or what foreign governments might do? But it's also part of this kind of mindless, indiscriminate attack on government. You go after the FBI, you go after the IRS, you go after all the authorities of government, and there's no discrimination here between those things that are necessary and legitimate and those that might not be. To me, it's just totally mindless, and it's just not in any way thought through in terms of its implications for American economic security or American national security.
And we've talked about this, Jonathan Lemire, before. It is mindless. This Reagan skepticism of the federal government has turned into nihilism, where you attack the IRS. You have the most senior Republican senator accusing IRS agents of taking AR-15s to Iowa and knocking down doors and threatening to kill small business owners, which is a total lie. You have the lies about the FBI coming and knocking down doors to arrest Trump supporters, a complete and total lie. So you have senators, powerful Republican senators, attacking the United States military every chance they get, even saying they wish that the U.S. military, strongest in the world, by the way, and relative to the rest of the world, strongest in the world in the history of the world. But you have Republican senators actually saying they wish our soldiers and Marines and sailors and airmen and Coast Guard officials were more like the Russian military. That's how sick this nihilism has gotten. And this hatred of all things American, this hatred for the United States military, this hatred for the chief law enforcement agency in America, it's gotten insane. And again, let me repeat, it's why they keep losing elections.
Yeah, and these attacks on American institutions, conspiracy theories, obviously part of Donald Trump's legacy as well. He accelerated it, whether it's the FBI, Department of Justice, the intelligence agencies, he went after them day after day. And it's just, and Richard, there's a connection here to how he opened the block too. It's these assaults on institutions of government, including the democratic institutions, when you lose elections that fueled January 6th and fueled what we saw in Brazil. And in fact, it's some of the same characters, as we detailed yesterday at length on this show. It's the Steve Bannons and Jason Millers and other people who worked for Trump are also pushing this same unrest in Brasilia. So my concern is, you came into the segment saying we used to export democracies, now we're exporting this. But it's not just to Brazil. What other countries do you feel like are vulnerable to this sort of conspiracy theories? Might we see a January 6th, not just in Brazil, but in other world capitals?
Well, let me say two things. One is it clearly helps our authoritarian foes. When they see the United States in political and economic, social disarray, they use this as justification for their systems. You see it regularly, for example, on Chinese and Russian media. They point to us and they use that to justify what they do at home. I would think looking around the world, I'm probably most worried about other parts of the Americas. Western Hemisphere was the part of the world that was advancing most in democracy a couple of decades ago. No longer. We're now seeing all sorts of setbacks. Mexico being one place, some other places as well. I would think also parts of Eastern Europe, obviously Hungary and all that. We've got to worry about that. It just makes it very hard for us to promote democracy by example. One other thing, I would expect one of the other places the Republican House is going to look to cut funding is going to be on stuff for democracy promotion abroad. Anything to do with quote-unquote foreign aid will be seen as a giveaway. You know that's going to be a popular target for these characters. But the part of the world I would worry most about is Latin America. And also, we have nothing else there. We don't have a trade policy. It's not a priority for American front. We tend to ignore it. The president went there the other day, but one visit does not a Latin America policy make. So it worries me that we're seeing a certain deterioration in the part of the world that's closest to us, and it's also then linked to immigration pressures. If we don't have a stable, successful Western Hemisphere, guess what? One of the ways it's going to show up is people moving towards the United States.